All right, welcome back to episode number 2 on the buckpower.com podcast network. This is the No Quarter Given podcast. I'm your host, Jason Powers, my co-host, Peter Blake. We are going to break it down, all things Atlanta Falcons. The Bucs rivalry with the Falcons goes all the way back to the 1970s when the Buccaneers just came into existence as a franchise, all the way up to now as one of our bitter rivals in the NFC South. So first off, I want to welcome Peter back to the podcast. Peter, welcome back, my man.
What's going on, buddy? How you doing?
Doing well, doing well. Before we get to the Falcons, we got to revisit last Thursday night, Raymond James Stadium, Super Bowl banner unveiled, NBC. Everybody thought the Bucs were going to win in easy fashion. Not so fast, my friend, like our boy Lee Corso says. Dak Prescott came out and played very well. The Buc offense was a little bit festive, and we like to have some turnovers. We've had 4 turnovers in the game, a little sloppy. You know, our running back situation. Fournette created a turnover, Ronald Jones. Your thoughts on the Bucs Cowboys 31-29 victory late Thursday night?
Exciting game. Look, Brady gets it late. Everybody in the building knows that most likely the Bucs are going to win, but the 4 turnovers, the 100 yards of penalties, just not a good way to start the season. Good thing they get that out of their system. I'm surprised by the Dallas Cowboys, but at the end of the day, the reason why Dak Prescott gets that extension is because what he did on the field last Thursday night, over 400 yards of passing. He looked great. And that defense has some work to do. And then on top of it, they had some injuries there that really hurt them, especially the SMB injury. But besides that, Bucs get the win 1-0, but lots of things to clean up. And good thing, Jason Powers, you got about 16 more games to do that.
That's right. And again, Tom Brady with another fourth quarter, last 2-minute drive. Ryan Suckup with the game winner at the gun, basically. Again, Buccaneer defense, like you mentioned, Sean Murphy-Bunting. Looks like he's going to be on IR, which is a minimum of 3 weeks, so probably 3 weeks to a month for him. No other major injuries that I saw other than Murphy-Bunting, but that's a big one because he's a good player in the secondary. Jamel Dean got picked on a little bit last week, but again, you expect the Buccaneers to clean it up a little bit as we head into week 2 with the Atlanta Falcons coming back to Raymond James for a week 2 NFC South showdown. Just give me your general, over the course of time, what is your general thought of the Atlanta Falcon franchise?
Well, I remember there was a lot of blowouts, and this has been a rivalry that has stemmed back to when they joined the same division in 2002. But even before then, there were some games there where there was a lot of blowouts. Didn't necessarily favor the Bucs. Don't have a lot of great memories. In fact, I remember watching a game, I think it was like the early 90s, late 80s, where the Bucs are just getting, it handed to them at the old Atlanta Fulton County Stadium where the Braves used to play. It's 35-7. You're still watching it, and it's like, oh man, this is not good. Will this ever get better? And then, of course, they're in the division together. And there's been some games throughout the years where the Bucs have, definitely been dominant. But, besides that, 28-27 in favor of the Falcons. It's always close. They're always close contests. Even last year.
Yep.
Jason, I'm going back to last year, that first matchup there, the Bucs have everything to lose at that point. They're down 17-0. I'm covering the game. We're doing the halftime show, and I'm speechless because the Bucs don't even have 100 yards of offense, and I have no answers, no solutions. Their defense is not able to get off the field, and of course, the Bucs come back and win that game 31-27 in care of Antonio Brown with the game-winning touchdown there for them. But it's always, close between both of these teams. And like you said, festive with the turnovers. It's always festive with the Atlanta Falcons and Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
My early recollections of the Falcons, obviously the Bucs and the Falcons were not in the same division. You would think they would have been geographically positioned where they are. For many, many years up until 2002, the Falcons were in the NFC West. The Bucs were in the NFC North, the Central Division with Green Bay, Minnesota, Chicago, Detroit, which was always an odd thing. I mean, Atlanta was out west with the 49ers, with the Rams, and those guys. So until 2002, when they did some division realignments, we didn't see each other a whole lot, and you would have thought geographically we would have been. But my early recollections of the Falcons, you probably won't remember this, but there used to be a little spot on the NFL coverage called Alcoa Presents Fantastic Finishes. It was just a little blurb. And one of the ones I always remember was Steve Bartkowski threw a Hail Mary to Billy White Shoes Johnson against the 49ers. And he caught the Hail Mary at like the 7-yard line on the last play of the game and juked like 4 different 49ers to get into the end zone to win the game back in the early 80s. So that was always my vision of the Atlanta Falcons. Bartkowski was a big-time quarterback in the 70s and 80s for Atlanta. Obviously, you had guys like Deion Sanders that played for the Falcons in the late 80s. William Andrews was a good running back. But that's the one memory I always remember about the Falcons was Alcoa Presents Fantastic Finishes.
Nice. Good stuff there. We're definitely aging ourselves. I remember Jerry Glanville. The whole thing was leaving tickets for Elvis because Elvis was supposed to show up. But, of course, Elvis left the building. I always remember Jerry Glanville making, that kind of fun. Of course, him and Sam Weiss, they would go. They had some trouble there because back in their
Cincinnati days.
Right, with Weiss hanging about 61 points on him and didn't necessarily like that too much. So I remember hearing the broadcast because once again, when there were home games, you're always listening to Gene, you're always listening to the broadcast because the game could never be shown because there was always blackouts. And I remember them running a linebacker a couple of times just to,
Jesse Solomon, who ended up playing for the Buccaneers.
Right. Which is crazy in itself, right? I mean, 6 degrees of separation and having an older linebacker be a running back just to, basically rub it in to the Bucs at that point. And they had no chance to win that game. That was Jerry Glanville being Jerry Glanville. But you got to have a great personality like that. Sometimes you got to have the villain, and Glanville, especially when they changed to the black colors, the black, and it's that.
And you had the era when MC Hammer was very involved with the Falcon franchise when they were making their Super Bowl run, Too Legit to Quit, the Dirty Birds, all that stuff in the late 90s. And we're gonna get to that. So hold your thought. We're gonna get to that. First thing I want to hit on: coaching connections between the Bucs and the Falcons. When you look at it, there's actually several names that have coached in both spots that the fans and the historians of the Buccaneers and the Falcons are very familiar with. Lehman Bennett. He was one of the guys that followed after John McKay. He was the head coach formerly of the Falcons. The Bucs hired him, I believe, in 1985 was the time they hired him for Lehman Bennett. The nickname around Tampa after he got hired was Lehman's Lemons because the Bucs were terrible during those Lehman Bennett years when he was the head coach here in Tampa. Dirk Cutter, obviously a former head coach of the Buccaneers, had many years where he was the offensive coordinator in Atlanta for Matt Ryan. You have Mike Smith, who was the head coach in Atlanta, then became the defensive coordinator with the Buccaneers.
Call that defense?
For Dirk Cutter.
I mean, Jason, come on. Did you watch Mike Smith's defense? Was that really defense at the point? I mean, I felt bad for the guy because he seemed like a great defensive coordinator until coaches get down here with the Bucs for some reason. That was one of the worst defenses that he was a coordinator of. I'll never forget it. It seemed like it was the 15 to 20 yard where the guy backs off 15 to 20 yards. That would be the quarterback. So the wide receiver. So I was like, what in the world is
soft coverage? Very soft coverage. Well, the funny thing is, Mike Smith had a very good run as the head coach in Atlanta. He won a lot of games.
Right. It was like a social distancing defense before the social distancing happened.
And last but not least, Rahim Morris, the former Buccaneer head coach, was the defensive coordinator last year. He ended up becoming the interim coach last year for the Falcons. When who was the coach last year that got fired in Atlanta?
The defensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys last week, Dan Quinn.
Dan Quinn, there you go. So Rahim Morris obviously had his history here in Tampa, and then he had some history in Atlanta last year. Now Rahim is going to be somebody we're going to see next week when we preview the Rams game because he's now the defensive coordinator with the Los Angeles Rams. So lots of Buccaneer Falcon coaching interactions between the franchises. So
who could forget the team, the Youngery team in 09 and then in 10 when they won 10 games before that? Because there was not a team that won 10 games with Rahim Morris and, of course, Josh Freeman. Never forget that, because that was the run for 10, and Bucs were so close to getting into the playoffs, if not for a couple calls. And, of course, Green Bay ends up winning that. They go on to win the Super Bowl that year, and they only had, I believe, like 9 wins, and they still won the Super Bowl. So,
all right, let's talk about the first ever Bucs victory. It wasn't a regular season game; it was a preseason game. They beat the Falcons in 1976. The game was actually played in Jacksonville, Florida. For who knows why it wasn't in Tampa or Atlanta, but it was in Jacksonville. Bucs get their first ever preseason victory against the Falcons, 17-3. You know, the Bucs win. They played 3 times in the 70s in the regular season. The Bucs were 1-2. And again, the Falcons weren't very good either in the 70s. So it was 2 struggling franchises, 1-2 in the 70s. You know, not a lot of history there. So we'll go to the 1980s. 3-2 record for the Buccaneers in the 1980s. Kind of the highlight of the 80s was probably 1987. One Steve DeBerg.
Whoa.
Who ended up playing for the Falcons, I believe, on their Super Bowl team as the backup quarterback in the 99th, in the year the Falcons went to the Super Bowl for Dan Reeves. I believe
who was the starting quarterback that year?
Chris Chandler, who's an ex-Buccaneer.
There we go. Crazy. The Dirty Birds, Jamal Anderson, the Dirty Birds.
Yes.
That team. Yes, absolutely.
But 1987, the Bucs scored 48 points in the season opener here in Tampa. Steve DeBerg had a huge game, you know, throwing the ball, and the Buccaneers. I actually remember that game vaguely because I was 14 years old at the time. I do remember that game when they scored 48, and that game, I think the Bucs have eclipsed that 48 total. I think the Bucs have scored in the 50s a couple times since then, but not up to that point. 48 was the high total opening day 1987.
And when you do something like that, people start to think, "Oh man, this could be the turning of the corner, right, Jason? I mean, this team is going to the playoffs." And then, of course, as you know, being a Buck fan,
and remember. That was game 1 for Ray Perkins. That was Ray Perkins' first game as the head coach. So obviously everybody's thinking new coach. He was very much a disciplinarian. He was the Alabama coach. Everybody thought, okay, here comes the new regime. Right. And it didn't go so well after that.
No, it did not. And it always was like that. And, you know, talking to Ricky Reynolds, a former Tampa Bay Buccaneer, during that time period, he would always say, he told me, I asked him about the 3 days, and basically, and he kind of echoed a lot of the thoughts that a lot of former Buccaneer players had to say about that time is, you know, once you get to those 3 days, you get to the season, you're basically just wore out at that point.
Done.
So the reason why, you know, you don't have those 3 days, and you can never have those 3 days today, is because the players are basically worn out. It's just amazing to think a coach who was coming out of college football, and I get it, he wanted to instill that Alabama toughness.
Junction boys, the Junction boy discipline.
Right. Bear Bryant type of mentality to the National Football League. And of course, it blew up in his face.
Yeah. And I remember going to those training camps. I used to go to training camp at the University of Tampa back in the late 80s, not early 90s, when they would have 3 days. My dad actually used to referee some of the practices for Ray Perkins, and he would tell me stories about how those guys were just cooked, knowing they'd have to practice. And literally all 3 practices sometimes were in full pads. It's not like it was a walkthrough, you know, it was three practices in pads hitting every single practice.
Pepin Rood Stadium, and you go out to one Buck place, you wouldn't even recognize it today. Back then, there were like little trailers. They're like little trailers out there.
Yes.
Crazy.
They were staying in the dorms at UT. They would stay in the dorms at UT back when UT was not very built up like it is today. So just, you know, obviously the NFL union and such has gotten way better with the conditions of handling player safety and all that stuff. But I mean, there would be a mutiny if a coach ever, first of all, you can't do it, but there would be a literal mutiny if a coach ever said we're practicing 3 times in a day in the Florida heat.
Yes, absolutely. As there should be.
Yes. All right, let's go to the 1990s. Well, first of all, 80s. Deion Sanders comes aboard in the late 80s in Atlanta, really sparked some interest in that franchise. They still weren't great, but they got a little better when Jerry Glanville got to town. 1990s, you had the kind of the Jerry Glanville run and shoot offense. Remember, Brett Favre was a draft pick of the Atlanta Falcons originally.
Yes.
He spent a year in Atlanta. Apparently, he liked the nightlife a lot of drinking, a lot of partying. And then the Green Bay Packers come in and swoop him up for a first-round draft pick, and the rest is history is one Brett Favre.
Yeah, and he was a second-round pick, and nobody knew what to think of him, I believe. And I'm trying to think of the college he played.
Southern Miss. Southern Miss.
But, of course, did he not upset our
Florida State
Seminoles?
Beat the Seminoles, and he beat Alabama.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, who would have known, right? And the guy couldn't even pronounce his name, Brett Favre or something like that.
Favre, yep.
Favre.
The 1990s was kind of the Bobby Hebert era of the Falcons. They were getting better. Glanville had them on a good trajectory. They could never really get over the top. They made the wild card game a couple times. Remember, they were in a brutal division with the 49ers of the 90s. The Rams were pretty decent several of those years. I mean, you weren't winning that division with the 49ers in town.
Even the Saints were in that. Isn't that crazy, Jason? I mean, the NFC West, you had the Saints, the 49ers, the Rams. I mean, geographically, it's all messed up. It didn't make any sense at all. You're exactly right. And, of course, it goes back to the too legit to quit. They were excited about what was going on there. Of course, you had MC Hammer and Deion Sanders, and Sanders is trying to be a rapper at that point because he could do no wrong. I mean, but as soon as he left the Atlanta Falcons, you were like, good. You knew when he went to the 49ers or the Dallas Cowboys, you respected him because he was a top corner in the game, but you knew that team had a chance. Both teams at the time had a chance to win a Super Bowl. And
because we all knew of Deion Sanders because of his Florida State days.
Correct.
So we were very happy when he got out of when he left Atlanta. And obviously the division, we were not in the same division at that point, but still, I mean, that was a big loss for the Falcon franchise. Was losing Deion Sanders because he was a ticket draw. You had the run and shoot offense with Bobby Hebert, Glanville, June Jones, all that kind of stuff was going on in Atlanta. And it was exciting in Atlanta. They were scoring a lot of points. They were giving up a lot of points. They were competitive. In the Bucs during the early 90s were not very competitive. This was before Tony Dungy got to town. Dungy got to town in, I think, 95 or 96.
Yep. 96.
Yeah.
96. Yep. And I look back at a game and I always go back to it because it's the best versus the best. And at the time, Horace Copeland as a wide receiver,
right,
matching up versus a Deion Sanders. And anytime a Buck or any wide receiver could beat a Deion Sanders, but Horace Copeland scores 2 touchdowns. One of those was against Deion. It looks like 2 touchdowns at that point were on Deion. And of course, the Bucs win 31-24. And I believe at the time, Craig Erickson is the quarterback out of where?
Miami.
There you go.
And Horace Copeland was a Miami guy too.
Yes.
And we had Lamar Thomas on the other side, who was a Miami guy. So, we were drafting a lot of Miami and Florida State guys, which is good. Because again, remember a few years later, we drafted Warwick Dunn, Derek Brooks in the same draft. Warren Sapp was before then, we really didn't draft any of the stud athletes at Florida State, Miami until about the early 90s. We started to do that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, you had Lawrence Dawsey. I remember him as a wide receiver. You also had Casey Weldon, who was in that game in 1991. Casey Weldon versus, of course, Lamar Thomas, Horace Copeland.
Yeah.
I'm one of the greatest college football games of all time. Of course, who could forget wide rights?
I was there, brother. I was on the field for that. I was the beginning of my, that was my Florida State career starting in 1991. So I lived it up close and personal. So I know all about it.
Never forget it, do you?
No. All right. So let's get to the late 90s. Tony Dungy takes over. We're going to the 2000s. The Bucs really are starting to ascend. The Bucs in the 2000s, they really dominated the series. They were 10-6 in the 2000s against the Falcons. Remember, 2002, they joined the division of the NFC South. The Falcons had that little 3-year run from like 98 to 2001 or 2, where they went to the Super Bowl. Dan Reeves was the coach. Chris Chandler, Jamal Anderson, all those guys kind of came aboard, and they were very competitive. but the Buccaneers with that Tampa 2 defense, Michael Vick comes to town in the 2000s as well. That really flared up this rivalry between Tampa and Atlanta, huh?
It really did. And, Vic, if you look at it, kind of dominated the league. But when it came down to Tampa, Tampa always had his kryptonite, and it was Derek Brooks, number 55. And
in the front four. That
front four would get after it. And you remember the game in 2002 where they just took over that game with the defensive effort with Derek Brooks. Or excuse me, I think it's Warren Sapp shoveling it, or no, it was Derek Brooks?
No, Sapp intercepted. I was actually at the game because I was living in Birmingham, and I would try to go to most of the times they play in Atlanta. I would try to get over. I was there that day. Sapp intercepted a fumble. I think it was a sack fumble. Yep. Sapp catches it out of the air, laterals it to Brooks, and Brooks goes about 30 yards for a touchdown.
Beautiful.
And we're actually, and it's funny you said that. We're gonna play the audio clip during this podcast of that touchdown, courtesy of Paul Stewart, our Buck historian from buckpower.com. So you're going to hear that audio clip of that touchdown here later in the podcast.
And I tell you right now, it is a daily thing for me to check Twitter and buckspower.com with Paul. All the clips that he has, he's definitely a Bucs historian. Love the clips. It brings me back to when I was younger. Just to see all that stuff, and brings back a lot of great memories.
No, for sure. I mean, and you had obviously in the 90s, 2000s, you had, all the Brad Johnson and all the, the whole throughout the 2000s, the Josh Freeman, again, very outside, kind of the Bucs started to go down in probably 2006.
I think it's 2003 when they're losing 30-7, and that's not necessarily the story at the point. Of course, the Bucs come back, they make it close, but the story is that Rich McKay has a falling out with John Gruden and the organization. And of course, everybody talks about Tony Dungy and Monty Kiffin as well as they should, but the true architect of this whole thing from the very beginning was Rich McKay. And yet he's in the press box with the Atlanta Falcons, and the Falcons are winning. I never would get that out of my mind. And then of course, you want to talk about players that, basically leave eventually. That would be Warrick Dunn. Of course, he left.
Right. Great point.
For the
Great
Super
point.
Bowl. So you see Warrick Dunn, you see Rich McKay, and you see the Falcons winning that game. And even though the Bucs made it close, it was just gut wrenching.
Because you remember Gruden and McKay had a falling out because Gruden always liked Bruce Allen, was kind of his guy.
Right.
And obviously, Rich McKay had been here for a long time as the GM. He
Right.
goes to Atlanta to be the GM and president of football operations for many, many years. And I believe he's still with the franchise in an administrative capacity. So again, another connection between the Bucs and the Falcons from a administrative perspective, because Rich McKay was he's probably been our best general manager in the history of the franchise, if you're fair.
I agree, besides Jason Light. But if Jason Light wins another Super Bowl here, you're going to definitely have to make the case. I mean,
right. I get it.
I'm kidding. Doing what Jason Light has done, but I absolutely agree with you. Rich McKay was absolutely a big time part of what was going on with this team. It was unbelievable.
All right, 2007, before we get to the last decade, Michael Spurlock. Do we remember that name?
Mm-hmm.
Michael Spurlock was a little-known return man from the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. He was the first Buccaneer ever to return a kickoff for a touchdown after 31 years.
I think
31 years as a franchise, and we finally run a kickoff back for a touchdown in 2007 against the Atlanta Falcons.
It seemed longer than that, honestly. I don't think it was a running joke. Would the Bucs ever be able to win in the cold? Yes, of course they did. Would they ever be able to win on the West Coast? Yes, of course they did, because they won their Super Bowl there. And would they ever be able to have a kick return touchdown? And of course they finally did it. And I still remember the broadcast. I'm just sitting there and I'm amazed. I'm like, is he going to do it? Has he done it? And the announcer's going crazy. And I believe the announcer goes, Santa Maria.
That's funny. Yep. That's, I believe that's Matt Vasgersian's. That's his.
It is.
Yep. That's his kind of his big saying for big plays. He's a baseball guy now for ESPN. If you're a baseball watcher, he's on ESPN every Sunday night. That's his big saying on a huge play is Santa Maria.
At the Maria. And it worked so well because, at the time, of course, the Bucs, Pirates and everything. It was just beautiful. It was absolutely tremendous.
So let's get to the 2000. Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Let's get to the 2010s. The Bucs are kind of in a downward spiral. They're going through coaches left and right. Rahim, Greg Schiano, Lovie Smith, all the names that we, Dirk Cutter. And finally, Bruce Arians here at the latter part of the decade. But the Bucs are 10-14 against the Falcons in the 2010s, highlighted by the 2014 disaster. I believe it was a Thursday night game in Atlanta with Matt Ryan and company, 56-0 at one point. The Bucs just get absolutely embarrassed on national TV.
I mean, yeah. And look, that's one of those moments where you're like, you don't think it's going to be a blowout. You're rushing to get there. You're rushing to watch the game because it's Thursday night football. The Bucs were never on prime time. You finally get the opportunity to be on prime time. And what happens? You get your doors blown off. And not only do you get your doors blown off, but you get shut out 56-0. Are you serious? I mean, it was just
they end up scoring 14, but it was at one point it was 56-0.
It was 56-0. I forgot because I probably turned it off. So it's 56-14.
Yes.
But there was moments like that in those 2000s, even when the Bucs went on prime time in that Falcons game. It's embarrassing because you're getting all your snacks together. You're getting ready to watch the game. You're with your dad at the time. My dad, big time Bucs fan, and we're excited. And, there's some type of optimism. Of course, you're looking forward to that game. And then just to look like that and have that effort was just so embarrassing. And if you went on Twitter, it was almost like the sky was falling at that point if you're a Bucs fan, because everybody and anybody were talking about it. And it was just like, okay, you can't really sell this anymore. This is bad.
And I believe that was year one of Lovie Smith.
Right.
2014. The guy that we had anointed, we really wanted. We brought him back. Everybody thought the old regime of Lovie and Monty Kiffin were going to bring back the glory days. And it was just a disaster in year one.
It was. And that was a foreshadowing of things to come, because you thought, well, Lovie Smith, he had this winning record with Chicago. Yep. Why didn't he get fired? He was in his basement and he's coming up with all these plays and he gets returned to the Tampa 2 defense. And it was nothing like that at all. In fact, it was a complete and total disaster at that point. Just a disaster.
Crazy.
Oh.
So we get to the end of the 2000s. Obviously, Bruce Arians is aboard. The Bucs are going this way, and it looks like now with Arthur Smith in charge, they're having to rebuild. Matt Ryan's at the end of the road. Probably they look terrible on Sunday against the Eagles. It's going to be interesting to see how long it takes this Falcon franchise to recover, because they got to get a quarterback. That's the first thing they got to do. Matt Ryan, this probably is his last year in Atlanta, one way or the other. You can't keep going with Matt Ryan. They got rid of Julio Jones. They're kind of tearing it down. Defensively, they're not very good. Your thoughts of the Falcon franchise, the state of the Falcon franchise, 2021?
Well, I mean, for me, they've had defensive problems for the last couple of years, and of course, that hurt them in that Super Bowl versus Tom Brady, 28-3. And of course, he's never going to let the Falcons live that down. He's always going to remind them of that. And for me, they should have drafted a quarterback in the offseason. You had Matt Ryan. He's declining. You have an opportunity to get a quarterback like a Justin Fields, maybe possibly a Trey Lance, somebody like that, even a Matt Jones a Mac Jones.
Right.
And you don't draft him. You go with Matt Ryan. You go with Kyle Pitts, and you look at the way they played against Philadelphia. They had so many deficiencies last year in the red zone, 26th, and they were still not able to really, do anything in that red zone, score a touchdown. So have they solved the problems? Of course they have weapons. No, they don't have Julio Jones, but they have Calvin Ridley. They have the young rookie out of Florida, Kyle Pitts. So they definitely still have some weapons there. And of course, Matt Ryan, if he can get time, which he couldn't get on Sunday, and that may be a matchup there, Jason Powers.
Shaq and JPP and Joe Tryon and the crew up front are licking their chops, because Matt Ryan got beat up Sunday against Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is not known to be a very good front four.
Why not put 56 on him? just like the Falcons did in the past, put 56 on them. That defense did not very well against the Cowboys. They didn't get after Dak Prescott enough. Put enough pressure on him, put him on the ground, and blow this team out. Look, they won both meetings, but like we talked about, it was close in the beginning in the first matchup when the Falcons came down here to Raymond James. They basically put them away on their way to the Super Bowl win. I would say, look, a blowout all day long. This offense needs to do what they did versus the Cowboys, and this defense needs to show up, and they got a great opportunity to do that versus this struggling Atlanta Falcon offense.
And you wonder if the Falcons are going to rue the day. Not that Kyle Pitts won't be a great player, but they could have had Justin Fields, who is a Georgia boy, grew up in the Atlanta area, went to Georgia. He could be the heir apparent to Matt Ryan, but they take Kyle Pitts, who again is a hell of a prospect. But if you don't have the quarterback, then Kyle Pitts is not very effective.
Right. And if you can't protect your quarterback and the quarterback can't get the ball to him, it doesn't matter how many wide receivers you have on the outside. We've seen that before with the Bucs. So
I think you'll see the Bucs win by minimum 17 points Sunday. I think again that the Bucs have had extra rest. They've had the long weekend. I think you're going to see a more focused defensive effort out of Todd Bowles. I think you're going to see them get after Matt Ryan, and I don't think the Buccaneer offense is going to get stopped by the Atlanta defense.
No, not at all. And watch the victim of volume and a Ronald Jones who's starting this week. Confidence back. He'll be fine. That offense will roll, and I absolutely agree with you. They can win this game at least by 20 points, and they should. All
right, Peter, before we get out of here, tell everybody where they can find you. Me and you are going to be doing some hosting this weekend for the Bucs pregame, halftime, and postgame show. Tell the audience where they can find us.
Absolutely. At Ducky Sports Lounge, 1719 West Kennedy Boulevard in Tampa, in downtown Tampa, right down the street from the stadium, live on NSPN, Next Gen Sports Media, where sports media evolves. And of course, you have an evolution. It's called the Sports Web. And on I Love St. Pete, we always say three things to cap off the show, to start it off and end it. Bring your passion, bring your excitement. Just don't bring any nonsense. I'm your host, Peter Blake, giving you something to think about.
Absolutely. Peter does a great job. I helped Peter with some of the analysis on the Sunday. We're at our remote location at Ducky, so he does a great job setting it up.
Let's be honest. You calm me down because there's times there where I feel like I'm rushed and you're like, just relax a little bit. You're kind of like the Aaron Rodgers, the steadying hand. Relax. Everything's going to be okay.
That's right.
And I appreciate that, Powers.
That's good. All right. So you're listening to the BuckPower.com podcast network. This is the episode number 2 of the No Quarter Given podcast. I'm Jason. Peter. This is all things Buccaneer history. This is the Atlanta Falcons episode. Next week, we're talking Los Angeles Rams. The Bucs got a very tricky 2-game road trip before we head to the epicenter of the football world, probably the biggest game in the NFL history, with our boy Tom Brady going back to Foxborough in week 4. But next week, we will preview the Los Angeles Rams Buccaneer history. So thanks for tuning in, guys. See you next week, and we'll be back with you on the No Quarter Given podcast.